Hello, listeners. Welcome to Sports Politica, the podcast that strives to help you understand how sports and politics shape the world around us. And with the 2024 Olympic Games in Paris right around the corner, there really is plenty for us to discuss. And if you want to have a conversation about the Olympics, well, there's really only one person to have that conversation with if you really want to understand what's taking place, the history surrounding the Olympic Games, and the socio-political context, and even more importantly, the dark underbelly surrounding this massive institution. And that's really Jules Boykoff. Now, I've known Jules for quite a few years. I followed his work very, very closely. And really, as someone who covers the intersection of sports and politics for a living, Jules's work has been absolutely essential. Now, he's the author of a new book called What Are the Olympics For? It's the sixth book, actually, that he's now published with regards to the Olympics, and it's a fascinating read that I highly recommend you pick up. And apart from that, Boykoff has written about the Olympic Games for publications such as the New York Times, the Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, you name it really, as well as an array of academic journals. Now, he's lived in England before and during the 2012 London Olympics and was a Fulbright Research Fellow in Brazil before and during the 2016 Summer Games. He's lectured about the Olympics around the world, from Tokyo to Paris to Rio de Janeiro to Los Angeles. And now he teaches political science at Pacific University in Oregon, and I'm absolutely delighted and honored to have him on the show today. So without further ado, here's Jules Boykoff. Hi, Jules. Welcome to the Sports Politica podcast.
It's so great to be with you. Thank you.
And as we were just talking about off air, I am a huge fan of yours. I have so much respect for you and the work you do. So I'm really delighted to have you on here. With the Olympics just a couple of weeks away, there was nobody on the face of this earth I would have been more interested to sort of guide myself and our listeners through this topic and all of its context than you, honestly.
Well, I am totally honored by that. And Kareem, I have admired your work for a long time, so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Wonderful. So let's start off straight from the beginning here. You recently published a wonderful book that I finished recently called What Are the Olympics For? Which offers really a lot of insight into, among many things, the history of the event, as well as the political context surrounding it and many of the additions that have taken place. Can you and this is a tough one, can you summarize what the Olympics theoretically represents and the influence it has on the world around us? It's sort of weird to try and have you summarize your whole book in one go, but just a of sorts for our listeners.
I like the challenge. I would say first just that I wrote the book for the critical thinking sports fan who cares about the athletes and wants to understand more what's happening behind the scenes in terms of the politics, in terms of society. And that's really why I wrote the book. And, I think the overall message is that athletes are what make the Olympics special. And I do plenty of celebration of various athletes in the book, but they're working in a very difficult condition created by the International Olympic Committee. And the International Olympic Committee, the way they organize the games, brings a whole host of problems to the city that is staging the games. And so I've had the good fortune of traveling to various Olympics, living in various Olympic cities. I lived in Rio de Janeiro. I lived in London. I've seen with my own two eyes that a city can bring a lot of joy in terms of the athletic spectacle, but that can also bring a lot of pain. And so that's what I tried to capture in the book, that sort of whipsaw back and forth, toggling between those two ideas. And I hope I achieved it in a certain measure.
I really think you did, but it's to me, this is a topic that could have, taken multiple books with so many of these cases being done almost individually, right? We have so many. I think one of the things I've always struggled with personally when it comes to the Olympics is how it's always been presented to me as this romanticized notion, this idea that this is the ultimate and purest athletic spectacle that can exist. Whilst it's been hard for me to see it as something that's not exploitative. Even if we're just talking about the athletes, let alone what's happening to the cities, is it not an exploitative event overall? Is it not one that exploits and takes advantage of these resources that it has, which are these human beings?
Yeah, the Olympic myths are an incredibly powerful drug, and most of us sports fans have been taking those drugs for a long time. So it might kind of shake your brain a little bit to think in a more critical way, like you're suggesting we ought to do. But it's true. We can do both at the same time, appreciate the athletes, but also, yes, we need to take a close look at what the Olympics are doing to athletes, to athlete health, to athlete well-being. Do athletes get a fair piece of the money pie? They absolutely do not. At the same time, like you're suggesting, there's a whole slate of problems. I mean, I could run through them. Cost overruns. This is every single Olympics going back to 1960 has cost overruns. Every single one, Kareem. Militarization of public space. It happens every single Olympics. We can talk about specific examples. Displacement of poor and marginalized people. Every Olympics, this happens. Greenwashing, talking a big environmental game, but not actually following through. And then actual real deal corruption. I mean, there's so much money swishing through the Olympic system. Some of it tends to swish upwards into pockets illegally, and that's just become almost an Olympic tradition of sorts. And so those are just a few of the problems that plague the Olympics behind that sort of shimmering scrim, that sort of set of myths that you're alluding to there.
So this might be a stupid question then, but then if there are so many issues that are coming with, as you're saying, pretty much every single edition of the games here, including these cost overruns, the militarization, as you mentioned, why are countries clamoring to host the games then?
I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that these are political and economic elites in each city that put forth these bids. In all my days studying the Olympics, I've never seen a grassroots bid where like local working people rise up and say, we want to bring the Olympics to our town. Just doesn't happen. And that's because the Olympics are this tremendous development opportunity. So if you're a well-connected construction baron, the Olympics are for you. This is like your once in a generation chance to really cash in. Politicians, they like this thing too, because there's a sort of built-in plausible deniability factor. I mean, you bid on the Olympics, but oftentimes you're long gone by the time the Olympics actually roll around. And so a lot of politicians are eager to use the Olympics like their own private trampoline to sort of boost their careers forward. And we've seen this numerous times in Olympic history. And so I'd say those are some of the reasons. A third that we absolutely have to talk about is some countries just have a lot of surplus capital lying around. I mean, let's talk about Saudi Arabia, for example. They have plenty of surplus capital. They've been plunging into sport, and they're eyeing a future Olympic Games. And so there's some countries that do it more from a economic perspective that is sort of married to this idea of sports washing. So there are reasons, but I would say that today there are fewer and fewer cities that are keen to host the Olympic Games, which puts the International Olympic Committee in a little bit of a funny spot. They've shifted the way that they assign the Olympics. It used to be they'd always assign them 7 years in advance. Today, they basically, hey, they say, if we can get you on the hook, we don't care how many years it is in advance. We're just going to sign you up and boom. I mean, look at Brisbane, which is hosting the 2032 Olympics. They got those Olympics 11 years in advance, so the IOC saw all those problems that you and I have already been talking about. And instead of saying, how can we address these things and make the Olympics more just? They said, we're going to make a backdoor plan to assign the Olympics long before a community can have a meaningful discussion about these various issues.
That's fascinating. And I wonder if that's a response to something we're starting to see just in the past few years with the Commonwealth Games, which is just cities actually saying, no, we changed our mind. We no longer want to host these events. Is this sort of a warning to the Olympic Games that, you know what, cities are starting to understand there's actual grassroots pressure and opposition to the Olympic Games? It's becoming too much for a lot of these governments to handle. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. And so when you think about games like the Commonwealth Games, the Pan Am Games, other sort of smaller Olympic-like events, those are often sort of like tryouts for cities. They have a chance to stage these games, show that they can do it to the International Olympic Committee, and then that they can make an argument that, yeah, you should pick us to actually host the big one, the actual Olympics. So, thinking about Saudi Arabia, they're hosting the 2029 Winter Olympic Games. You heard me right, Winter Olympic Games. That's going to be quite the interesting thing. But, part of that is just demonstrating to Olympic honchos that, look, we can pull these big events off, and we want the big one. We want the Olympics. But, to put it in a wider perspective, just for a second, there has been a rising tide of anti-Olympics activism, and it's had a real effect. I mean, between 2013 and 2018, more than a dozen cities just said no to the Olympics, either through a referendum where they got to actually vote on it and they voted no. Just the mere threat of a referendum was sometimes enough. Or in the case of Rome, somebody was elected, Virginia Raggi, as mayor of Rome on an explicit anti-Olympics platform. So she won the election because she was against the Olympics, and that killed the bid. And so in that environment, the International Olympic Committee sort of realized they needed to do something different, and this is what they're doing.
That's really, really interesting. But I do wonder that as the Olympic Games is losing these democratic locations and cities to host events in, is it driving them into the arms of authoritarians, or am I being too nice to them? And this was something that they were always intending to do anyway, is sort of link up arm in arm with authoritarians, and mainly because they can skip past a lot of the bureaucracy that comes with it and the resistance, right?
Absolutely. And some IOC members and members of FIFA have been very direct about this in the past. They've said they actually prefer to work with autocrats because they don't have that pesky democratic factor that they have to deal with all the time. But, I think when it comes to the International Olympic Committee, they have a long track record of showing a conspicuous tolerance for tyranny. I mean, we go back in history, and they've long aligned themselves quite happily with autocrats, budding authoritarians. You mean, look at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin that gifted Adolf Hitler with this opportunity to sports wash what was a horrific regime that was emerging. It was obvious at that time that the oppression of Jewish folks, Roma people, others was happening. It was very clear. The International Olympic Committee went out of its way to look the other way. And that's exactly what it did. And it wasn't just it wasn't just the International Olympic Committee. It was publications like the New York Times that gave glowing reviews to Hitler as like the unequivocally best leader in the world at that time. And so that was kind of pivotal going forward. You might think of South Africa being banned from about 1964 to 1992 from the Olympics, but that was very much against the will of the International Olympic Committee. They did not want to ban apartheid, racist South Africa. They went out of their way to keep them in as long as they could. It was just the threat of a boycott from other countries that scuppered their love for including South Africa. And it goes on and on. And I would just say one last thing on this, Kareem. As somebody who keeps a really close eye on the International Olympic Committee, that organization itself has become markedly more authoritarian in the way it runs itself under its current president, Thomas Bach. The German former fencer in the Olympics has been running the International Olympic Committee with an iron fist. A smaller and smaller circle of people have power. The rest of the organization is essentially a rubber stamp. And let me just give one quick example because I don't want to make it seem like I'm just going off the cuff here without evidence. In that time I was mentioning before where the IOC needed to decide what are we going to do in terms of bidding because fewer and fewer cities are game to host the Olympic Games, they came up with this new scheme whereby, as I mentioned, you could bid at basically any time. And if you could get the costs to line up and you could get the governments to say they'd cover the costs, the IOC wanted to lock them in. That was a scheme made by a guy in the International Olympic Committee named John Coates, a very powerful member of the International Olympic Committee from Australia. He's also extraordinarily arrogant. I mean, this guy is really something special. He could do a whole podcast interview just on him and his life. But he comes up with a scheme. And guess what? As I mentioned, who was the first country that took advantage of it? Australia, where the guy happens to be from. So what they did was they created for each the Winter Olympics and the Summer Olympics a smaller group of about 10 IOC members who are on a special commission to decide basically who's going to host the next games. And then the rest of the International Olympic Committee, today there's a little bit over 100 members. They're basically like ka-chunk, rubber stamp it, whatever that smaller group says. Now that raises a lot of problems because that smaller group has tons of power. You've concentrated power in these small number of people. And last point on this, I mean, if you looked at the last election of Thomas Bach, it felt like you were watching an election in a dictatorship where they couldn't have been more fawning and obsequious and otherwise sycophantic. They were standing up and they were like, oh, dear leader, thank you so much. There's no one else that could lead the International Olympic Committee. I mean, it almost felt like a Saturday Night Live kind of skit or something. And, something for your listeners and us to keep an eye out for moving toward those Olympics in Paris is that there's a decent chance that Thomas Bach and his allies inside the International Olympic Committee might pull a power move where they kind of remake the rules so that Bach can run again for president. In theory, he's supposed to step down, but it wouldn't surprise me if they changed the rules to accommodate him moving forward. We shall see.
Goodness me, he really is learning from his dictator buddies. It seems now unlimited terms in office. Wow, I mean, it's a significant step there. Is it this? All this sounds a lot to me like another group I cover, which is FIFA, of course, with its current president and dear leader as well, being Gianni Infantino. It seems like there's a cult of personality being built around him, and it also does seem like the organization, as much as we used to complain about the corruption of FIFA in the era of Sepp Blatter beforehand, it really seems to have just ramped up under Gianni Infantino. And what's been a bit odd with regards to processing it in the media is that it seems to have been normalized, as if, well, what can we do? This is just how it is now. Is this sort of is this what you encountered in your work, covering the IOC? Is this sort of the response that you also get from the media that tend to feel that it's become normalized?
Absolutely. And the media are part of that normalization process as well. I think it's worth pointing out that Gianni Infantino is also a member of the International Olympic Committee. So as if he's not busy enough running FIFA, he's also, at least in theory, going to these IOC meetings. He'll be in Paris, for the Olympics and all that. And so it just shows the sort of interweaving of the power network at the highest echelons of sport. And these folks look out for themselves. They don't look out for you. They don't look out for me. They don't look out for host cities or countries. They very much look out for themselves. And so I definitely feel like on one hand, there has been a certain normalization. I have to say, though, on the other hand, in the 15 or so years that I've been doing research and writing about the politics of sports mega events, I've seen a lot more of a critical discussion in the public sphere. Whether that necessarily gets translated to change is a different question, but it's pretty notable to me how many critical journalists there are out there. I mean, you've been leading the pack for a long time. So has Dave Zirin, people like that, Shireen Ahmed. But there's a lot more people thinking critically about the Olympics, like even just sort of everyday journalists who get assigned it at the last minute and they start looking around a little bit. They're like, whoa, there is incredible corruption going on here. Sometimes it's illegal corruption. Sometimes it's been legalized, the corruption. But I do feel like there's been a real shift in the way we talk about these things with much more complexity. And I'm really here for that. I mean, I think that's a very good, positive thing. The only issue is, how do you convert that critical thinking about these sports mega events, whether it's the World Cup or the Olympics, into actual change? And the reality is that the International Olympic Committee, just sticking to them and the Olympics, are the biggest sports festival, the most complex sports festival, but they're also quite arguably the least accountable. There are just no actual watchdogs that have actual power that's watching the International Olympic Committee or FIFA. And that's where we kind of always run into the brick wall. Is like, how do you reform these organizations? They seem basically incapable of doing it from within at this point.
That's that's troubling in so many different ways, because I have referred to entities like the IOC and FIFA as almost as a mafia, because to me they do operate outside of the norms, outside of laws, and in a structure unto themselves, really. And it's really a $1 million question you're asking here, Jules, which is, how do you translate this sort of a raised awareness and engagement and critical analysis that we're seeing now? And you're right, there is more of it than, say, when I started coming up and entered the space of the intersection of sports and politics. Translating that into actual change has been something that's been beyond my reach, at least with the topics that I've chosen to cover. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying I think we're still wrestling with how to figure out exactly how to approach something like that. These are behemoth entities that we are up against as well, being the IOC, FIFA, etc. They're giants in and of themselves, and it's very difficult to figure out how to oppose them. And it becomes even more disheartening when we see countries like France engage with them the way they have, I think. And I think this is a good segue for us to get into the upcoming games themselves, Paris in 2024. So to me, in many ways, I guess to the average person, they'd say, well, this is happening in a democratic country. You'd expect a lot less controversy coming out of this games, right? But I think, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, it feels to me like I'm hearing more and seeing more criticism and controversy coming out of France with this Olympic Games. Can you give us a sense of what's been happening and what our listeners should be keeping an eye on?
Absolutely. I mean, just real quick, as a sort of history nerd side note, is that when change tends to happen inside these organizations like the International Olympic Committee, it's when a rival pops up and really gives them a run for their money. So the 1920s and 30s, there were these worker games run by mostly socialists and communists in Europe that really put the pressure on the International Olympic Committee to reform. Same, there were women's games in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, the Olympics have a horrible history of exclusion of women. And women said, okay, we're going to organize our own Olympics. And they did. And they were tremendously successful. Today, we're seeing some other alternatives to the Olympics that maybe we can think about in the bigger picture, which is like the enhanced games, if you've heard about them, the people that are saying they have the same critiques that you and I have been talking about here today, but they say, so therefore we should open the barn doors to full throttle doping, like enhance yourself however you want, athletes. I still need to be convinced that that's going to be okay in terms of athlete health, but they're also talking about giving big sums of money to athletes. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in the sight of that happening, World Athletics has stated that they're going to start giving prize money to their gold medal winners. And so I think sometimes it takes that kind of alternative pressure from the outside to make these organizations creak into motion. Mm-hmm. But in terms of Paris, I think that it is definitely the most politically charged Olympics that we have seen in decades. No question about it. For starters, France said that they were going to be different. I mean, that was their big pitch, was that we're going to bring a positive legacy. We're going to sidestep all those problems that people like Karim and Jules are talking about. But guess what? If we go through the problems, they have been doing them one after the other. So, for instance, they are having cost overruns, about 115% cost overruns right now, according to a recent study by Oxford University. And that's not even the final tally. I mean, these numbers tend to go up as construction companies put the screws on to make that last minute deadline, or security officials say, oh yeah, we need one more battalion out there, et cetera. It's going to cost you. And it is like the mafia in certain ways, like you described, and they get their money and the price tag goes up. Second, what about displacement? Oh my gosh. In the lead up to these games, there's been activists in France from this one collective that everybody should know about called Le Revers de la Médaille, the other side of the medal. And they've been out there fighting for the rights of migrants and for unhoused residents of Paris who've been scooped up in the early morning, thrown on buses, and taken to other cities in Paris. Just get out of sight, out of mind before the Olympics happen. What about the militarization of public space? Well, France said it was going to be different, but guess what? In early 2023, the French National Assembly passed a law legalizing AI-powered video surveillance, making it the first country in Europe to do so. Now, they supposedly are going to get rid of it in March 2025, but it doesn't take the imagination of an avant-garde poet to come up with scenarios by which they decide to keep it in motion because they tell us, oh, we staved off X number of terrorist attacks. We can't tell you the details, of course. It's secret information. We're going to really need to keep this, right? There's going to be like tens of thousands of security officials on hand there. What about greenwashing? I mean, they talked about a big green game, but the reality is that they have a long ways to go. And, the people that I've been interviewing on this topic who follow these issues carefully argue that basically the Olympics as they're currently constructed can't be a fully sustainable event because of all the people flying from all around the world. Let me just give you one horrifying example of how it's hard to say that Paris 2024 is green. Is, for starters, they have the surfing competition in Tahiti. Setting aside the sort of colonial dimensions of that decision, it's 9,700 plus miles away. So the people are racking up all these air flight miles to go there. One. Two, when they were putting in an optional Olympic tower to get the best video of the activities in the surfing competition, the barge that rolled into Teahupo, this beautiful, renowned area for surfing, was basically grinding up the delicate coral reefs. You could hear the locals screaming in agony as this barge rolled in and crushed the coral reef. So it's hard to convince me that this is sustainable activity. And finally, corruption. I mentioned that before. It's endemic with the Olympics, so much money swishing through. Well, France currently has 4 open investigations into corruption around payments with the Olympics and bribery. So, yes, France said it was going to be different, but in reality, they sound quite similar to the trends that we've been talking about today.
And it's really so disappointing to see. I'm a bit of an amateur surfer myself, and what's been going on in Tahiti has been heartbreaking to see. And that was one of the shocking elements, which is like, oh, I see. France is really going to be no different to what we've seen elsewhere. And it goes to show you that I don't think there's a way to hold the Olympic Games in a way that is actually truly sustainable or that will engage and help a community rather than destroy it long term. All these arguments that have been made about increases in tourism, isn't it just now that we're seeing reports out of Paris that the tourism is even drying up because everybody got the message, which is this is not the place to be in this summer? I actually know a couple of people who are going up, and I remember we're sitting down having a conversation. This is in Egypt, and everybody at this table is maybe 10 people at this table turn around and say, why? Why are you going? Usually you'd think you'd want to go to these things. If it was a FIFA World Cup, despite the same problems going on, people would be flying around to go, but they're not going to Paris. So I don't know. It doesn't seem to me like there's any. Basically, what I'm trying to say is there any relevance to the games, to the modern games? Is there actually any relevance to them? Because it doesn't seem to me like there's anything positive to gain here.
Mm-hmm. Well, for starters, I mean, you started this conversation by raising the specter of Olympic myths. And one of the Olympic myths that boosters of the games proffer is that the Olympics improve tourism in the host city. But if you listen to industry groups like the European Tour Operators Association, they will tell you that actually hosting the Olympics hurts tourism in cities where you already have tourism. I mean, this is not some like avid band of Marxist economics professors. This is the European Tour Operators Association. These are like staid, careful people who try to give the best advice to those who pay them to give them the best advice. And they say it won't improve tourism. And I've seen it with my own two eyes. I mean, when I was in London, living there for those Olympics, the theater part of the city was just decimated. Like they were told, oh, there's going to be all these tourists coming through. But Olympic tourists are a specific type of tourist. They basically go to the sports events and then they go back to their hotel or Airbnb now. And they don't go to a theater production at night. So these theater companies got totally dinged. Same thing with what's happening in Paris right now. And you're seeing a real fretting coming out of the arts community that normally has a lot of people come there that are actually staying away. And it's not just the tourists. I mean, if there was a recent poll in France that found that more than 40% of the local population thinks that the Paris Olympics are, quote, a bad thing. Okay, 44%. So, it is not a popular thing in town right now. Now, usually what happens is once the Olympics sort of click into gear, people get on board, have a little bit of fun. But to your question of, it has the Olympics sort of seen its day, there's no question that there's a sort of fuddy-duddy factor attached to the Olympics. And that, I think, helps explain why maybe they've taken on new sports like surfing, like skateboarding, now like breakdancing will make its debut, trying to sort of tap into a younger crowd to make the Olympics relevant, at least on a sporting level. But I just feel like the word is kind of out there now that, the Olympics aren't what they seem. And we're at a really interesting moment of flux when it comes to the games and what's going to happen moving forward. The fact is, you just can't really have a huge Olympic spectacle involving more than 10,000 athletes like the Summer Games does without making a huge carbon imprint. And, they just really need to think about, do we need the big Olympics? Could we do this in more of a regional fashion? Could we limit the number of tourists who attend? Maybe they have to be able to get there by train in order to attend, thereby lowering the carbon footprint. These are the kind of questions that you would think the International Olympic Committee would be interested in entertaining if they are, in fact, interested in being more green. But these are very much off the table when it comes to them right now. Instead, they're more interested in, are there recycling bins in the Olympic Village? Check. Are we offering less meat? Are we giving more vegan options? I mean, these are all great things. Like, yes, please, let's all recycle. Let's, think about your meat consumption because it has real effects on the environment. But like, this is just like the smallest of things, where the big thing is this carbon bomb in the form of the air travel from all these people that are traveling to see the Olympics.
It almost feels like that's an example of, how corporations approach, sustainable development and stuff like that. It's very much like sort of this corporatization of climate change is how we're seeing it, that they're far more interested in these recycle bins than they are in the actual air travel required to get there. But with things like, the ongoing climate chaos, and I mean, we can look even further than that and say the other atrocities taking place in this world, including the war on Gaza right now.
Hmm.
Is there really a place for holding the games? But I think everything you've told me so far suggests that the Olympics wouldn't give a damn about something like that. So let me rephrase this question in a different way and say, what is your view about the IOC's decision to say allow Israel to to compete at this upcoming event without the same restrictions that were placed on, say, Russia? Right.
Hmm.
That's the real concern here, is this lack of, I guess, equality across the board. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you raised this really important issue. And if the International Olympic Committee thinks it's not going to crop up in Paris, they are deceiving themselves. So let's kind of break it down. Let's get really specific on this because the specifics really matter. Let's back up. Why did the International Olympic Committee say that Russia cannot participate under their flag and anthem in
Mm-hmm.
Paris? Well, there were two reasons that the International Olympic Committee gave. One was that they broke the Olympic truce when, during the Beijing Olympics, they invaded Ukraine. The Olympic truce is basically a resolution that the United Nations passes every couple of years. It's kind of like a symbolic gesture. It's never been enforced. I mean, sheesh, the United States was invading Afghanistan and Iraq over the course of multiple Olympic
Mm-hmm.
Games, and no one said a word about the Olympic truce during that period. I think that's fine, but we're going to set it aside because it's not really relevant to this. As the other reason is the other reason that the International Olympic Committee gave to make Russia compete as individual neutral athletes, not under their flag, not under their anthem, is because Russia, the military, took over particular land inside of Ukraine that contained sports clubs that the Russian Olympic Committee then took over those sports clubs and started running them. Well, hey, if you look at what's happening in Gaza, and your reporting has been instrumentally important on this, I have to say, Kareem, look at the decimation of basically every single soccer facility inside of Palestine. Look at your reporting about Yarmouk Stadium, where the Israeli Defense Forces took over that stadium and used it for interrogation of people. How different is that really, taking over sports grounds? I mean, I'm not saying it's the exact same thing as Russia, but hey, history never gives us with crisp facsimiles that are exactly the same, right? But I'll
Mm-hmm.
tell you what, it sure is similar. So what has the International Olympic Committee been saying about this? Basically nothing. I mean, people have been asking them about that, and they say things like, oh, we're going to make sure that the Israeli athletes get to participate and they're safe at the Olympics and all that. So, in other words, what we're seeing is selective morality, a double standard, and it's one that actually could cause a lot of trouble for Israeli athletes and fans themselves at these Paris Olympics. I mean, that's a real concern that I have, is that it could endanger, the decision of the IOC could endanger athletes and fans at these Olympics. And I think this is going to be something that we have to keep an eye on moving forward. But there is a real question, and a lot of activists out there, and not just activists, academics, and lots of other people, politicians, that are wondering out loud right now, why does Israel get to compete in the Olympics despite the ongoing genocide in Gaza and all the incursions in the West Bank as well?
We're actually also seeing a lot of activism taking place with people calling for a boycott of Israel and sanctions placed on Israel in the world of sports, whether it be in FIFA or in the Olympic Games. Honestly, I'm all for the activism. I absolutely agree and understand with the approach here. Hell, I wrote an article for The Guardian making a case for the sanctioning of Israel in sports. But since I have you on here, Jules, I want to play devil's advocate for 1 second and say, do Olympic boycotts actually work though? Because I mean, I'm thinking primarily of, what we saw in the 80s with, the boycott of the Moscow Games and then the subsequent boycott of the LA Games, right, by the Soviet Union. You tell me what you think here, because I'm really, really curious as to, maybe it's the cynic in me that doesn't tend to believe boycotts like this actually work and they tend to be too over politicized. But
Yeah.
you tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, the tit for tat boycotts in the 1980s, you could argue they didn't do that much. I mean, they did hit McDonald's pretty hard because McDonald's at 1984 Olympics said that if a U.S. medalist, someone gets a gold medal, they're going to give out these like free Big Macs or whatever. And because the Russians weren't there, the U.S. scooped up all these medals and basically cleaned out McDonald's of all their employees. But you could say that worked. But I think if we go back a little bit further, you can see the power of the Olympic boycott and what I was alluding to before with South Africa. I mean, there's no way that the International Olympic Committee would have come down on South Africa and banned them basically from participating were it not for the fact that dozens and dozens of countries around the world said that we're not going to show up. It wasn't just one country, it wasn't just two countries. It would have been a huge loss of different countries. And so I think it very much depends on the context there.
Mm-hmm.
I think where it gets tricky with the Israeli athletes in heading to Paris is that most of them, as far as I can tell, haven't taken stands in public about the war. They'd probably just assume ignore it. So the argument a lot of people say to me is that, oh, you're just punishing those athletes. And that's why I think, if you were to take the path that the International Olympic Committee has taken with Russia, where instead of just banning them outright, you say, all right, you need to meet certain standards, like you can't be speaking out in favor of the war. In the case of Russia, like wearing one of those Z's that denotes support for war. And if you meet these standards, you can participate. I don't see why you couldn't do the same for Israel. They can participate, just they get to participate as neutral athletes. But, it's not just Olympic myths that are powerful drugs. So is political nationalism. And, the idea of not being able to participate under your flag will really rile up some people. I'm very fully aware of that. But it would allow them to participate and at the same time acknowledge the atrocities that are ongoing in Gaza and the West Bank.
You make an excellent point with regards to, I mean, if you're applying the same standards with Russia, that would mean things like not necessarily outright bans and sanctions, but, competing as neutral athletes, not using the flags, etc. And the fact of the matter is that Israeli athletes that will be competing, some of them will be active IDF soldiers. And we know how the Olympic Games and the IOC came down hard on Russians who were affiliated with the Russian military. So I just don't see why the same can't be applied here. It's really, really disappointing. And yes, disappointing in one sense, unsurprising entirely in a different sense, unfortunately. But otherwise, Jules, I think we've had a wide discussion here about the many issues with, I think, the Olympic Games. Any listener right now, I think, would have a hard time sort of being excited for the upcoming games. But say those who still do sit down to watch the event, is there anything you want them to focus on or to be left with, or to take away from this conversation?
I guess what I would say is the way I've approached thinking through the Olympics is that you can do two things at once. You can support the athletes who are getting absolutely screwed by the system in terms of the amount of money that they get and don't get. You can support the athletes while at the same time fiercely critiquing those in power who are exploiting their positions in order to make more money for themselves and their organizations. You can do both at the same time. And in fact, I think that if you are an Olympic fan, I know a lot of people out there are, it's like this incredibly recognizable symbol. We all have our favorite Olympians from history and probably from the present as well that you'll be rooting for in Paris. I think root for them, absolutely, but don't turn a blind eye to the suffering that the Olympics create. In fact, you fans of the Olympics have much more standing than the grumpadelic academic who rolls into the room and says, I don't like sports, and here's why, People don't want to hear from that guy. So you actually have power as a sports fan and a little bit more sway when it comes to the kind of conversations that are happening in the public sphere, but also in private conversations that you might have with your relatives, with your family, with your fellow people that you play sports with. So do not give in to the death of complexity. I say try to embrace both sides of that if you can.
That's very, very well said, Jules. And it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you. I feel like we can talk about these topics for hours and hours, but I will leave it at that for our initial conversation here. And I look forward very much to having you back on again.
Thanks so much. It was a real treat to slow down with you. Thank you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. And to all listeners, please take a moment to go buy Jules's new book, What Are the Olympics For? It's an excellent read that I highly recommend.